The day the walls learned to listen began at 8:58 a.m., when the sun slid through a wall of glass and set every inch of stone and chrome ablaze. The Whitaker estate had been built to impress Italian marble underfoot. Art perched where the eye might stumble and then kneel. Air-conditioned silence that swallowed every footstep whole. On any other morning, Daniel Whitaker would have savored that silence. It meant control. It meant power. But not today. Today, silence was a countdown. Daniel checked his watch, a gold one. The sort people gift themselves when a boyhood hunger finally grows up into a brand. He paced the length of the grand hall, phone against his ear, voice level and clipped. Behind the closed doors of the conference room, 3 men in robes the color of new paper waited with their palms loose on leather folios, their eyes steady, their patience not endless. "Another agency," Daniel said into the phone. "Find me someone who can be here in 20 minutes. Classical Arabic. Gulf dialect. No, I don't care how improbable, just do it." He hung up, then called another number, and another after that. He traded courtesy for velocity, lowered his voice when it would help, raised it when it wouldn't. The answers, bright and apologetic, were all the same. No one. Not in time. A junior assistant hovered near the pillared archway, eyes flitting between Daniel and the giant pendulum clock on the far wall. "Mr. Whitaker, sir?" Daniel didn't stop pacing. "What?" It's the interpreter. He texted. He got car sick and had the driver pull over on the 10th. He won't make it." The words were a match. Daniel felt the flame lick up the side of his throat. He won't make it. He tasted the sentence once as if it might turn to sense if he chewed it. It didn't. "We have a $300 million deal on the table with men who asked for one non-negotiable, a fluent translator. And you're telling me what you're telling me we have bottled water and mirrored tablets and no translator. Yes." Sir, through the crack of the conference room doors, Daniel could see the investors' silhouettes, one older, square-shouldered and composed. One younger, with a trim beard and a gaze as precise as a ruler. A third, quieter, the kind that measured twice and cut once. They murmured to each other, their voices too soft to catch. "Keep calling," Daniel said. "Call every agency. Call the university. Call the consulate. Bribe a professor. I don't care. Just..." He opened his hand and let the sentence fall without finishing it. Down the hall, past the museum-bright staircase and the vases imported to impress an audience no one ever met, a woman in a gray uniform wiped a handrail until it remembered the idea of being clean. The smell of citrus disinfectant rode the morning air. She moved with a quiet economy, not timid, never timid, but practiced at being unseen, the way people who work in other people's houses learn to fold their own bodies into corners. Her name was Amina Nadir. People in the house called her the maid, if they said anything at all. Amina heard everything. She always had. It was how you survived in rooms not made for you, ears open, mouth closed, eyes a fraction past the obvious. The words at the far end of the hall ricocheted and softened and came to rest within her. Translator. Arabic. Non-negotiable. 300 million, no one. Not in time. She could have kept wiping. The cloth in her hand had more work than any one morning could handle. She could have vanished back into the stairwell light and let the afternoon deliver whatever new orders it had planned. It would have been safer. It would have been what the world had trained her to do. A memory rose anyway, uninvited. Her father sitting under a groaning ceiling fan in Khartoum, chalk dust ghosting his knuckles, writing two versions of the same sentence on a blackboard, one in Arabic calligraphy, so fine it felt sung, the other in English print as square as brick. He would turn and say, "Both are doors, Habibti. Your job is to know which one to open and when." Amina lowered the cloth. For a single breath, she let the old teacher's voice carry her. She watched Daniel Whitaker run a hand through his perfectly arranged hair and fail to find the reassurance he wanted hidden there. He was the kind of man who had never learned to say, "I cannot," except as a dare. That kind of temperament built empires and broke people in the same gesture. The junior assistant Vanessa Cole, all polished bone and ambition, was refreshing a list of agencies on her tablet. The tendons in her neck pulled tight as wire. Beside her, Bianca, the household manager whose voice could cut glass, was already letting the day's disaster become a story in which she had predicted everything and been ignored. Amina set the cloth on the banister. She didn't move forward. Not yet. The line between audacity and foolishness had a way of biting back. Daniel spoke again, this time to no one in particular. "They think we don't have our house in order. That's the story that gets told when anything goes wrong. That's the story that kills deals." He glanced toward the conference room. "We have 6 minutes." The clock swung. The sun moved a fraction. Amina looked at her hands and saw, absurdly, that the cuticle of her left thumb needed trimming. Sometimes the body insists on the small to avoid falling into the large. She took a breath. She stepped into the hall's center, into the clean light built to flatter oil paintings and people who had learned how to be painted. "Sir," she said. 3 heads turned: the billionaire, the assistant, the household manager. None of them were accustomed to the gray uniform producing speech on request. Daniel blinked. "Yes?" "If you like," Amina said, choosing each word as if moving stones across a creek. "I can try to translate." Vanessa let out a sound that wanted to be a laugh and remembered at the last second where she worked. Bianca's mouth tilted, not a smile exactly, more like the memory of one on a face that did not dance much anymore. Daniel frowned, not cruelly, just truly confused. "You can translate." Classical Arabic. Gulf dialect, yes. Amina kept her gaze steady. "My father taught linguistics at the University of Khartoum. I studied languages before I had to leave school. I speak both behind the doors." A chair moved against wood. A little impatience spilled into the hall like water under a door. "Say something," Daniel said, in Arabic. Amina turned her head toward the doors, toward the men who could end her employment with a gesture, and said, in polished Fusha that still carried the music of her father's voice, "Honorable guests, forgive the delay. We wish to begin with respect, and respect requires clarity. Without clarity, business has no meaning." The words slid under the door and found their ears. A low murmur answered. Surprise first, then something warmer. Daniel's brows went up a notch. Ego and relief wrestled on his face and did not come to an immediate decision. He looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the clock. Bianca looked at Amina the way a cat looks at a bird that has decided today it will no longer be a bird. "Sit," Daniel said at last, motioning toward the conference room. "Make it count." Amina walked forward. The cloth was still in her hand. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron and stepped into the room where her existence had been designed to evaporate. The investors rose on instinct old-world courtesy, meeting an unexpected variable. The eldest of them smiled, the kind of smile that says at last, a problem with a human face. "Assalamu alaikum," Amina said. "May our conversation be honest, and our conclusions honorable." They sat. She took the empty chair beside the visitors, not at the end of the table and not by the door. She set her palms flat, the way her grandmother once did when bartering for flour in a market that would have preferred she had stayed home. Names were exchanged. Cards slid across the table like the first stones of a bridge. Daniel cleared his throat. "We're grateful you're here," he began, looking to Amina. She offered his words back into the room in a voice as steady as a metronome, carrying not just the syllables, but the intentions behind them. When the eldest investor replied, she put his meaning into English not as a literal copy, but as a twin born of the same mother. Minutes found their rhythm. Slides glowed and clicked past. English and Arabic mirrored on twin tablets, a small river of understanding running between. It would have been enough, perhaps, if Amina had only carried words across the water. But she had learned long ago that meaning lived in the spaces between speech. Where a syllable could soften an edge, she softened. Where precision could prevent offense, she sharpened. Where pride tried to speak louder than truth, she turned both down until they could hear each other. Half an hour in, Amina's eye snagged on a typo in the Arabic presentation, one letter bent wrong, so that licensing suggested leasing, a mistake that could become a court case if left to ferment. She corrected it in her delivery without ceremony and felt, rather than saw, the quiet nod of thanks from the investor, who had noticed the same thing and wondered whether to trust the universe today. At the 40-minute mark, the conversation drifted toward intellectual property rights, which is where men who like to smile for photographs often choose to hide their knives. A draft clause lay in one of the folders, translated from English by someone who had depended too heavily on software and the mirage of sufficiency it promised. The Arabic muddied the waters in a way that, if signed, would have handed Whittaker Dynamics more than any decent partner would accept and less than any honest man would want to steal. Amina paused at the first whiff of confusion. She asked, gently, whether the intent was this or that. The older investor breathed out in relief. The younger one's eyebrow ticked. Daniel sat forward a fraction, enough to let the room know he had registered the danger. Words were reset. Intentions were placed back into their proper boxes. The clause was tabled for redrafting. By the time the second carafe of mineral water shone with condensation, the temperature in the room had changed. Men who had entered guarded now leaned toward each other with the easy precision of craftsmen who respect their tools. 2 hours later, when pens found paper and signatures tucked their names into the world, the eldest investor said, in Arabic, "Trust is a language too." Today we spoke it. Amina gave Daniel the sentence in English as it wished to be heard. "They consider you trustworthy, thanks to Ms. Nadir." Daniel looked at her then the way a man looks at a door he had assumed was locked. Respect arrived, a little breathless, carrying apology in its pockets without yet knowing where to set it down. When the room emptied, when the doors closed and the house exhaled, Amina stood to gather her notepad. The cloth she had tucked into her pocket slipped free and landed beside the pen that had just ferried millions into a single future. "Where did you learn to do that?" Daniel asked, not unkindly, almost as if asking for a recipe from a bake sale he had not expected to enjoy. "Life," Amina said, "and the silence of rooms where no one expects anything from you." Daniel did not answer. The sentence stood in the space between them like a small monument, The next morning, the air had a taste to it, the way air does after lightning strikes somewhere you can't see. People saw Amina in places where yesterday their eyes had slipped right past her. Greetings offered themselves, some sincere, some the currency of those who spend their lives converting proximity to power. Vanessa found her near the landing where mornings collected like spilled light. "Good morning, Amina," she said. Sweetness left out on the counter a bit too long. "Good morning, Ms. Cole," Amina said. "So," Vanessa said, her smile tight, "your moment made quite an impression." Amina let the smallest smile touch her mouth. Sometimes one day is all it takes to change everything. Especially when it's earned. Vanessa's jaw did a slow chew on invisible gum. "Right." At 10, Daniel called Amina into his office. He had already sent a car for the house's best coffee and then pushed it aside after 2 sips. He looked less curated than usual, his tie loosened as if humility had fingers. "I spoke with our partners," he said. "They want you at the next round of meetings." "Officially." "As what?" Amina asked. "A translator?" "As our international liaison for the Middle East and North Africa." The title stumbled out and then stood up straighter, as if surprised to find itself standing at all. Compensation to match. Authority to match the responsibility. Amina sat, not from shock, but from the calm knowledge that big asks go down easier when a person's feet are on the ground. "Do you trust me?" she asked. "Or are you trying to save your deal?" Daniel considered that for a beat, that stretched just long enough to be honest. "Maybe both. But I saw something yesterday I can't unsee." Amina nodded. "Then I have 2 conditions." "Name them." "No more uniform." "And I don't use the back door." Daniel breathed once as if surfacing. He smiled, the first one that didn't feel purchased. "Deal." They stood. The house was the same, but the floor remembered Amina's weight differently now. She didn't float. She didn't shrink. She moved like a woman who had decided to belong. Behind them, Bianca watched the interaction from the kitchen's bank of security monitors. Her lips a straight line. Her hands hovered over a keyboard. She knew 100 ways to keep a house standing. She had just remembered she also knew a few ways to make one stumble. Corporate headquarters did not have the Whitaker estate's beauty. It had edges and glass and a hum that smelled like electricity. But a building is a building, and meaning comes from the people who teach it how to breathe. When Amina walked through the revolving doors 3 days later, her new ID badge clicked like a sentence ending at the right time. On the 14th floor, the partners were already seated, the skyline behind them arranging itself into an audience. Daniel greeted them with the choreography of a man taught to put his hand where it would photograph well. But when Amina entered, they rose in welcome, the eldest of them saying warmly, "Welcome back, Ms. Nadir. The room has been impatient for you." They sat. The work began. Amina's job title included liaison, but what she practiced was older and less nameable. She adjusted tone so offense never found a place to sit. She translated jokes so they could arrive alive on the far shore. She explained the particular rhythm of a handshake, the custom of beginning with T, the importance of not confusing speed with respect. An hour into the session, a courier delivered an updated draft of the intellectual property agreement, printed and tabbed. Vanessa's initials appeared on the cover page VC, which meant she had routed the document through her desk. The Arabic looked tidy at first glance, the kind of tidy that software can give you if you accept its invitation to stop thinking. Amina didn't stop thinking. At line 13, a phrase had been shifted half a degree, the way a carpenter might move a beam by inches and call it negligible, not counting the roof coming down in the first storm. The clause, as adjusted, took patents developed on foreign soil and tucked them into Whitaker's pocket without due process. The English version said one thing. The Arabic now said another. Amina's fingertip paused over the line. She did not let the pause become panic. She did not look at Vanessa's initials again. "Mr. Al-Mansour," she said, addressing the eldest partner with the respect of kinship rather than flattery. "There is an inconsistency here. The Arabic would grant ownership that the English does not. I believe the intent was to mirror the English. May I propose a correction now so we do not misunderstand each other later?" The room stilled. It is a particular quiet, the quiet that comes right before something breaks or before something is bound back together more tightly than before. Amina explained the difference, not as an accusation, but as a relief. The younger partner leaned back, studied her, then looked at Daniel. "Is this your intention?" he asked in English. Daniel had the grace to look completely surprised and a little ashamed of it. "No," he said, "it is not." Amina offered a revision out loud, careful as a surgeon, and wrote it onto the page in Arabic while a paralegal marked the corresponding English. The sentence settled into itself with a small click only people who love language can hear. In her periphery, Amina saw Vanessa come to the conference room doorway and stop, as if she had forgotten why she had come. Later, an email would travel through HR with Vanessa's name in the subject line, followed by a meeting in a room that served coffee and consequences. When the meeting adjourned, the eldest partner placed his hand flat on the table, the old gesture of oath and gratitude. "You are not a translator," he said softly in Arabic. "You are a steward." Amina bowed her head, because some compliments are crowns and should be carried lightly. That evening, under a sky the color of steel cooling, Daniel texted a question he had not practiced. "How are you? Truly." A few minutes later, her reply arrived. "At peace." "You? Trying to figure out who I was before yesterday, and why I let him last so long. It is a curious thing, how a thread forms between two people who were not looking for cloth." In the days that followed, as Amina prepared to fly to Abu Dhabi for 3 months to stand in the doorway between cultures and invite both to sit, Daniel found himself writing to her without the bullet points he had once believed essential to any human exchange. They wrote about work first, because work is safer. Then they wrote about the little places, in a life where a person hides their true name. He told her about the neighborhood he came from, how the cupboard had once been a door that opened onto a room full of nothing. She told him about the balcony in Khartoum where her grandmother had taught her to braid hair, and how the braid is a language 3 strands separate, one thing together. "Come with me when you get back," Daniel said over the phone one midnight. "Not to a steakhouse. To the block where I learned to run fast for reasons that had nothing to do with exercise." "Maybe," Amina said, a smile in her voice he could feel through the line. "I will decide how much truth you can handle." Abu Dhabi at night looks like the future inherited the earth and kept the stars as trophies. Amina stood on a hotel balcony with the city laid out like a thought experiment below her. Inside, her younger sister, Hannah, slept easily for the first time in months. The doctors had called it stable. Amina called it mercy. She had told Daniel she would not leave without Hannah. He had said the word of course so quickly it did not have time to turn into performance. The days in the Gulf moved with a purposeful grace. Amina sat at long tables and short ones, in rooms with carpets soft as memory, and in offices where the views did most of the talking. She took tea, She listened more than she spoke. She learned the rhythm of these particular men, where their pride was sorrow dressed in armor, where their generosity was a door kept open without fanfare. In a private ceremony, at the end of her first month, the eldest of the partners pressed a small gold pendant into her palm, a flat circle inscribed with the Arabic word for wisdom on one side and courage on the other. "You did not translate our words," he said. "You translated us." Amina closed her fingers around the metal and felt, for a second, something nest against the bone of her hand, like a bird that had finally decided this was the human it would trust. She texted Daniel a photo of the pendant resting against her skin. He wrote back a single line. "You are changing the shape of my life, and it scares me in the first good way I've known." "Fear is the tax we pay for transformation," she typed. "Pay it. The road is worth it." 2 years later, people in suits and people in robes stood on a stage beneath a new piece of signage. The building that had once been called Whitaker Dynamics now read Whitaker and Nadir International, the ampersand in the middle like a bridge even grammar could not deny. Amina did not wear a badge that day. She did not wear one the day after either. Her name moved through documents of policy and partnership. It introduced speakers from podiums. It surfaced in newspapers in the half-tone photographs reserved for those who are learning how to stand without apology. On the morning the sign went up, Amina returned to the estate where the first door had opened. It did not feel like a mansion anymore. Somewhere in the months that had followed her first translation, the house had been peeled and reassembled into the Whitaker Nadir Foundation for Leadership and Literacy, an institute that held Saturday classes under chandeliers and career nights in a library where the only thing louder than the books was the laughter. In the garden, a circle of girls from neighborhoods with more police cars than playgrounds sat on a rug and listened to a mentor describe the difference between being loud and being heard. Amina stood with her hands in her pockets and let the sight settle into her, the way a person watches a seed they planted break the ground at last. Daniel came to stand beside her. He looked like a man who had learned to live in his body for reasons that were not about selling it to cameras. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Amina asked, eyes still on the girls. "I remember the first time I really saw you," he said. "You were holding a rag. And somehow I understood you were carrying more than that." "I was. I still am." They walked through the garden without the house trying to turn them into something else. Near the herb beds, Daniel stopped, as if his pocket had buzzed with a thought too insistent to ignore. "Sometimes," he said, "I wonder what happens if the interpreter makes it that first day." "You'd have closed the deal with difficulty," Amina said, not unkindly. "And I'd still be scrubbing bathrooms that no one remembers using." He nodded. "And none of this would exist." Amina turned to face him. "Do you know why this worked?" "Tell me." "Because when someone like me walks into a room she was never invited to and stays, the world has no choice but to rearrange itself around that truth." Daniel looked at her with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with guilt, and nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with awe. He did not reach for her hand. Some moments ask you to keep both hands open. From across the lawn, a girl not yet 12 sprinted toward them, notebook clutched to her chest. "Ms. Nadir," she said, breath making its own music. "I wrote something. Will you read it first?" Amina crouched so their eyes met level. "Of course," she said. "The world needs your voice." The girl laughed, the unself-conscious sound of a future that expects itself to exist, and ran back to the group. But stories are not made only of highs. There were days in those 2 years when the empire almost resembled a family, and days when it remembered it was a corporation instead. There were meetings where Amina's suggestions were taken and turned into someone else's credit by the time they reached the minutes. There were donors who loved the idea of girls reading under chandeliers and hated the reality of girls asking to sit on boards. There were also mornings when Hannah's health wobbled, and Amina found herself holding both a board book and a board agenda in the same hour, choosing which one to let fall. Daniel learned to be a leader who did not treat sacrifice as currency others owed him. He brought in a chief operating officer who understood that building bridges is easier when you budget for maintenance. And there was Vanessa. The HR meeting had not gone well for her. Things that begin as formatting issues have a way of ending as intentional misrepresentation when placed under light. She left the company, loudly in private, quietly in public. For months after, she sent emails to old contacts in which the story shifted until she almost believed it, until the day she saw a photo of the new sign with the ampersand and felt something break in a place no X-ray could see. She requested a meeting with Daniel. He agreed, because redemption is a word he was learning not to keep for himself. In a coffee shop where people made business deals without the theater of it, Vanessa sat across from the man she had once tried to manipulate with the kind of finesse you learn on late nights in a certain kind of college. She was older by 2 years, but her anger had aged faster. "I was loyal," she said, hands wrapped too tightly around a paper cup. "You were loyal," Daniel said, "to a version of me that liked loyalty more than truth." She didn't argue. The silence did what it was built to do. "What do you want to be now?" he asked. She did not have an answer. She left with a smaller story to tell and a larger one to find. On a winter afternoon, when the air had that clear quality that makes people feel like they can see themselves, Daniel stood in his office with the city looking back at him. He had begun to visit the neighborhood where he learned to run. He had begun, also, to stop running. Amina knocked and entered without waiting for a come in. Some doors have to learn to open simply because the right person is standing there. "The partners want to establish a joint research hub in the Gulf," he said, words landing in a rhythm that told her he had rehearsed them to make sure they came out clean. "They asked for you to lead the cultural and communications front. On site. Full authority." 3 months. She studied his face not because she doubted the content, but because she had learned to pay attention to the music under the words. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. "Because it is good business, or because you see me?" He stepped closer. "Both." "If I go," she said, "Hannah goes with me." "Of course," he said, and the word did not put on any makeup. "Anything you need." She turned toward the window. The sunset had found a way to turn the glass into a painting. "All my life," she said, "people told me you can't. I have learned to answer. Why not?" "Teach me," he said. "I intend to." There were whispers, of course, there always are. The kind that turn admiration into rumor, that tie competence to romance because the former is too threatening to name plainly. Daniel and Amina did not audition for the parts assigned to them by other people's projections. They met for coffee in rooms not designed to prove anything to anyone. They argued about the correct use of semicolons. They made plans and then burned them when life threw a better map onto the table. They walked his old block after dark, the streetlights flickering in a way that felt like memory. He told her about the man he might have become if money had arrived a year earlier or a year later. She told him about the woman she had been required to be in a dozen rooms that paid her to vanish. They did not make promises they couldn't keep. They made a life out of showing up on time for the people who depended on them. At the foundation, girls learned to write cover letters and eviction appeals with equal fluency. Grandmothers learned to ask questions at doctor visits, questions that had been waiting in their throats for decades. A shelf of children's books featured characters with names that had once been called hard to pronounce by teachers who had never tried to learn. Sometimes, on Friday evenings, Amina would bring Hana to the kitchen, where she had once folded herself into a corner. They would sit at the enormous table and eat soup while the house hummed with the noise of a place that had finally learned how to be used. "Do you ever miss your old rooms?" Hana asked once, spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "No," Amina said gently. "I miss the version of me I might have become if someone had made space earlier. But I like the version that arrived." Hana nodded the way only little sisters can. "I like her too." The first time Amina addressed a global summit, she wore a suit the color of dusk and a pendant that caught the light at her collarbone. She spoke about the mechanics of trust in cross-border partnerships, about the ethics of building wealth on land that belongs to other people, about the absurdity of pretending language is only words. When she finished, the applause rose like weather. In the second row, Daniel found himself clapping with a kind of pride that felt more like gratitude. He did not think of himself as a man who had given Amina an opportunity. That fiction had burned away long ago. What remained was the knowledge that she had given him a map for becoming someone his grandmother might have liked. Afterward, as they stood by a window that made the city look like a model of itself, he said, "You were extraordinary." "I was prepared," she said. "There's a difference." He smiled. "Teach me that difference, too." "Bring a notebook," she said, "and stop pretending your handwriting is better than it is." It is tempting to end there, at the height, to set the story in amber and sell it as a lesson without the messy parts. But the messy parts are the lesson. There were consultants who told Daniel to lean harder into markets where the faces looked like his because predictability scales. He told them unpredictability had built his life twice, once badly, once better, and that he would like to keep betting on the version that grew more people, not just more profits. There were men who tried to explain to Amina how to perform humility so that their superiority could remain undisturbed. She performed nothing. She nodded when a point was sound and turned a quiet, devastating mo into a form of art. There were days when grief came round, the grief of what had been taken by systems that could not pronounce her name without an apology attached. On those days, Amina would sit in the Foundation's library and run her fingers along spines with titles that would have made her father go quiet with joy. She would close her eyes and hear chalk on a board, two scripts twinning into a life. "Both are doors," he had said. "Know which to open and when." She had opened the right one. On the anniversary of the Foundation's opening, they held a small ceremony in the garden. The girls read poems, one about a mother who learned to ask for a raise and got it, one about a bus driver who had an entire classroom's worth of names memorized by the second week of school, one about a girl who used to sit in the back of a room and learned that the front is not a place you are assigned, but a place you choose. Amina spoke last. She did not talk about her title. She talked about the first day and the rag in her hand and the way life had taught her to see a crisis as a door that might open if you simply walked toward it as if it were yours. She thanked the women whose names are rarely said into microphones: housekeepers, nannies, receptionists, cafeteria workers, nurses, people who keep worlds spinning and are asked, far too often, to prove they exist. After the chairs were folded and the lights dimmed, Daniel and Amina walked the perimeter of the old lawn. They did not need to speak to know what the other was thinking. Some silences grow up and become language. "Thank you," Daniel said finally. "For what?" "For walking into a room that didn't know it needed you and staying." Amina shook her head. "I didn't stay because the room needed me. I stayed because I needed to belong in the world that was already mine." The room had to learn that. They stood under a tree that had outlived 3 landscaping fads and 2 realtors. Somewhere in the house, a vacuum hummed somebody preparing for tomorrow's child.